In this video, I want to look at functions inside of PHP, how we're going to declare them, call them, pass parameters, and all those other types of things. So let's get started. Here I have a file called functions.php for us to test working with our functions. I have an old variable called myvar, and it just has a string value of myString. And that's okay. We're going to use that in just a little bit. Right now I want to declare a function. And to declare a function inside of PHP, I need to use the function keyword. And I'll simply specify function. And this is going to be demo. And I'm going to then give my parameters, which in this case I have no parameters. And I have my braces. Everything that's inside of my braces is going to be executed when I call my function called demo, or whatever my function name is going to be. Now, I can put any legal PHP code in here that I want. I'm just going to start off with something simple. Just saying that we're going to echo inside of a function. Now, when I call this function, this will print. Now, right now I'm not calling this function, and we can do a test of this real quick. I'm going to call my functions.php file. And you notice it prints out my string because it had that, but I don't see anywhere where it's saying that I'm inside my function. That's because the function has not been called. So let's take a look at what's going to happen when we call this function. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to create a paragraph tag in HTML. Then my PHP tag. And I'm just going to call demo simply by calling the variable name and giving an open and close parentheses. This isn't going to go and call my function because it exists. And because it exists as a function, I can have this called multiple times, such as you see here. I come back to my browser window real quick, and when I run it, you'll notice that inside function occurs multiple times. One for every time I called my function. And if you're familiar with programming in other languages, you're probably familiar with this basic concept. We can declare a function, have it perform some operation, and then call that function over and over again to get it to do different things. Now, calling a function over and over again without passing any parameters means that the exact same thing is going to happen. Wouldn't it be nicer if we could give it some values and maybe make a different change? So let's take a look at that real quick. I'm going to delete out my function calls real quick. I don't need them. And I'm going to create another function. Function, square it, and I'm going to give it a value in my parameter list. You'll notice that as a parameter, being a variable, it starts with a $sign. And right now, if I hover over this, it's a little bit different color because I've not used it. And so my editor is just warning me, hey, you haven't used this variable yet. That's all it is. It's not really an error. We're going to use it in just a second. What we're going to do is we're going to say echo. Then we're going to do an open paragraph tag. I want to add another value into my echo before I close it out. Now, to do that, that means I need to concatenate a string. And PHP uses the period as a concatenation operator. So a lot of languages, they use something like a plus or an ampersand, something like that. PHP is going to use a period. So all I'm going to say is period value. So the square of and the value is, and I'll put the value. Now, the easiest way to simply square something is to say value times value. And that's just a real easy way to do it. And then finally, I'm going to close out my paragraph tag. down underneath where I print out my I don't need to say echo because I'm calling my function, and my function has the echo in it. So square it, I'll pass a value of 3. What's nice with this is I can give it some different values. So I can say 4 and maybe even 13 to give it a really different value. When I reload this page now, it comes up and says the square of 3 is 9, 4 is 16, and 13 is 169. So this is where I can call different functions and get different values simply because I pass in a different parameter. And something that's very, very beneficial to me. Now, you might be wondering what happens if I don't pass a parameter to it. So I have here square it and I don't pass a parameter. Well, you should start to get a hint by my IDE. It comes over and it's going to say, hey, this function is looking for a mixed value, and it doesn't see it. This expects one argument and it gets 0. If I reload this screen, it starts to display my screen, and then it starts to display errors. And this is the way error handling is done on my personal setup. I have it so it displays these errors. And the sole reason for this, for me and my personal setup, is I use this for testing so I can see things like this. So what happens if I wanted to have an optional parameter? Well, that's kind of interesting. PHP gives us an interesting way of handling this. It simply is I can take my parameter value and say equal to. Now, when I say equal to, you might go, well, what does that do? Well, if I get passed in a value, it uses that value. But if I don't pass in a value, it takes the value of 2 because that's its default parameter. If I save this and reload it, now notice that when it's not called, instead of giving all these error messages, I get the square of 2 is 4. So it took that default parameter and used its value. So far, looking at functions, we've looked at how do we declare a function and how do we pass parameters, including a default parameter value. Let's look at how we're going to return a value now. So start off with function. I'm going to say double it. And I'll give a default value for that. And instead of having the echo statement here, I'm going to return a value, and I'm going to have to do something with that value later on. So I'm going to say return value times 2. So this is going to double my initial value, and it returns it. If I take one of my function calls and change out square it for double it, now I should get the double value. However, when I go and reload this screen, you'll notice it doesn't display because I'm not doing anything with that return value. Now, I could put it into a variable. I can maybe add it to the output stream via the echo command. But right now, none of that is happening. In fact, this is just kind of going into a digital wasteland and being completely forgotten. So let's look at how we're going to do something with this return value. I'm simply going to specify echo, and then we have double it. I'm going to save this. If I reload it, now notice that 8 appears. It's only 8. I don't know why there's an 8, but I have called that function, returned its value. I'm taking that return value, I'm doing something with it. I'm using the echo command. And that's what allows it to print to my output stream and now show up inside my browser. So that's what I'm expecting. Now there's one more thing we haven't done yet with our functions. And that is we haven't used one of those external variables. You can specify function. And I'm just going to call this output it. You might say, well, shouldn't you be passing something in? And typically the answer would be yes. But in my case, we're not going to do that because I want to use my var. So I'm going to say echo $my var. And you'll notice right away my IDE is giving me an underline. You might say, well, why is it doing that? My var is clearly defined up here on line 2. And it recognizes that's a variable. It recognizes it's a string value. Why is it not displaying here? Why is it saying it's undefined? Well, that's because it's defined outside of its scope. So scope inside of PHP is looking for things defined within the same function. Now I can define things further within a set of braces inside of a function, and that works too. But I cannot reference a variable outside of my function unless I'd say that I'm using a global variable. Now to do that is going to be real simple. On my first line inside my function, let's say global myvar. And notice as soon as I specify global myvar, my error message from my IDE went away, because now my function can see that variable and it can use it. This is helpful if I define some values, maybe some global values I need to, some initialization or config type of values. I can define them and then I can use them in other functions later on. This also is a little bit dangerous because anything that we use with global variables, I have a risk of changing, and that might cause an issue. So I need to be careful in doing this, and this isn't the only way to define values from like a config standpoint, but it is one way that we can do it, and it's a way that you fairly commonly see inside of PHP. So that's the basic information that you need to know about PHP and function calls.